Unaware his wife secretly owned a $50 billion empire, he canceled her flight home after her mother's funeral. What would you do if your spouse abandoned you at your most vulnerable moment? This is where the story begins. Grant canceled Nora's flight home less than 3 hours after she buried her mother, then told her not to come back to the apartment they had shared for 12 years. At 4:17 on a gray Tuesday afternoon, Eleanor Brooks Hale stood beneath the fluorescent lights of Savannah/Hilton Head International Airport, with rain still darkening the shoulders of her black wool coat. In one hand, she held a folded memorial program bearing Dr. Vivian Brooks's photograph. In the other, she held her passport and phone while the check-in kiosk flashed a message she read twice before touching the screen again. Reservation canceled. Around her, suitcase wheels rattled over polished tile. Families embraced near security. A child cried because he had dropped a stuffed bear. Nora drew one slow breath, tasting the bitter remains of funeral coffee at the back of her throat, and entered the confirmation number a third time. The same message returned. At the airline counter, an agent studied the record and lowered her voice. The purchaser canceled the ticket through the corporate travel account at 3:41. The purchaser was my husband. Nora did not phrase it as a question. The agent turned the monitor slightly away, protecting information she could not release. The travel administrator used the account credentials. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Hale." Nora's phone vibrated before she stepped away. Grant's message filled the screen. "Stay in Savannah a few more days. I need the apartment tonight. We'll talk when I'm ready." She stared at the words until the letters stopped resembling language and became what they were, a locked door sent in 12-point text. That morning, Grant had stood beside her at Bonaventure Cemetery in a charcoal suit, one hand briefly touching her elbow while the minister spoke over her mother's grave. He had left before the family meal, claiming an urgent Altair call in New York. Nora had believed him because grief had reduced the world to immediate tasks: sign the register, thank the choir, hold her aunt's hand, remember to breathe. Now she called him. The line rang once before going to voicemail. She tried again. This time it rang longer, long enough for her to imagine him watching her name appear. No answer. Then a notification rose from social media. Camilla Price had posted a photograph 15 minutes earlier from a familiar floor-to-ceiling window. Manhattan glowed behind a crystal wine glass. The edge of Nora's cream sofa appeared in the lower corner, and Grant's hand, his wedding band removed, his silver watch unmistakable, rested beside a bottle on the marble table. The caption read, "Big decisions require the right company." Nora's fingers tightened around the memorial program. Not enough to tear it. Never enough to damage the last photograph her mother had chosen. She moved toward a quiet row of seats near the glass wall and opened the Altair travel app. Her corporate profile had been disabled. She selected the card Grant called Ours, entered a new commercial flight, and watched the payment fail. A second message arrived. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. The apartment staff have been told not to admit anyone tonight without my approval." He believed the canceled ticket, frozen travel profile, and disabled card formed a complete border around her life. For years, he had paid household expenses from accounts in his name and spoken of every convenience as something he provided. Nora had let him believe dependence was the same thing as peace. She lowered her phone and opened her wallet. Behind the canceled corporate card sat a matte black credential with no bank logo, only the words Brooks Capital and her name embossed beneath them. Her thumb rested on its edge. 6 years earlier, her mother had placed that card in her hand and told her never to use authority merely because she was hurt. Nora slipped it back into the wallet without making a call. Not yet. First, she requested written confirmation from the airline showing who canceled the reservation and when. Then she saved Grant's messages, Camilla's photograph, and the disabled account notice in a single folder. By the time Grant poured another glass of wine in Nora's penthouse, convinced he had stranded his grieving wife in Georgia, she was no longer staring at the departure board. She was building a record. Grant did not just cancel Nora's way home. He called to explain that every room, card, and convenience in her life existed because he allowed it. She was still seated near the airport's glass wall when his name appeared on her phone at 4:29. Rain traced the runway beyond her reflection, and the folded memorial program remained protected beneath her palm. Nora answered without greeting. Behind Grant's voice came the faint clink of silverware and Camilla's laughter, softened by distance, but unmistakable. "I saw your calls," he said. "Then why didn't you answer?" "Because I knew you'd be emotional." Nora watched a plane lift through the rain. "You canceled my ticket after my mother's funeral. I postponed your return. There's a difference. The airline says the purchaser canceled it." Grant exhaled as though she were forcing him to explain something simple. "The ticket was booked through my company account. The travel profile belongs to Altair. I can change it whenever I need to. And the card. Also mine." His voice sharpened with satisfaction. "You keep forgetting how much of your life runs through accounts I control." Camilla said something near him. Grant lowered the phone, answered her, then returned. "I'm hosting a private dinner tonight. Senior people from Altair will be there. Camilla and I need the apartment without a scene." Nora's gaze remained on the runway, but the words pressed against the bruised grief had already left behind. "You brought her into our home. It's my home too." "That wasn't my question." Silence stretched for half a second. Then Grant chose cruelty over denial. "You've been gone for 3 weeks. The company is moving toward the most important transaction in its history, and I need someone beside me who understands what's at stake." Nora heard Camilla's voice more clearly now. "Tell her we'll have the guest room packed." Grant did not correct her. "You should stay in Savannah," he continued. "Use the time to handle your mother's things. When you're calmer, we can discuss what happens next. What happens next has already started. Don't dramatize this." His tone became almost paternal. "You have no independent income worth discussing, Nora. The foundation role was always something I encouraged because you needed purpose. The apartment staff, the travel, the cards, the lifestyle, those came through me. I am trying to make this transition easier than it has to be." Nora looked down at the Black Brooks Capital credential hidden behind the disabled card. Grant had attended charity dinners where her family office's name appeared in small print. He had heard her mother speak about logistics properties in governance meetings, then dismissed them as old family obligations. Because Nora never corrected him publicly, he had converted her silence into an accounting system in which everything visible belonged to him. "Are you asking for a separation?" she said. "I'm asking you not to return tonight. Those are not the same thing. They will be if you force this." Another burst of laughter rose behind him. Several voices now. The dinner had already begun. Grant lowered his voice. "The board needs stability before the Meridian Atlas closing. I'm introducing Camilla as the person who will lead Altair's next phase. You appearing in mourning and demanding explanations would undermine everyone." Nora's breathing slowed. "Has the investment closed?" "It's effectively done." "That wasn't my question." "You wouldn't understand the distinction." She let that sentence remain between them. Then she asked him to confirm, in writing, that he had disabled her travel profile and card and instructed the building not to admit her. Grant gave a short laugh. "You think documenting this changes who owns what? Send the message." He ended the call without answering. A moment later, Camilla posted another photograph. This one showed Altair executives gathered around Nora's dining table beneath the painting Vivian had chosen for the penthouse years earlier. At the head of the table, a place card read Camilla Price, future president. Grant had not merely kept Nora from entering her home. He was using her absence, her address, and the night of her mother's funeral to stage a future he did not yet have the authority to promise. Grant's next message arrived as a document, not an apology, because he believed paperwork could turn abandonment into authority. Nora was still beneath the cold airport lights when an email from Altair's executive office appeared on her phone at 4:52 p.m. The subject line read Temporary Access and Residence Acknowledgement. Attached was a 2-page PDF prepared on company letterhead. It stated that, for personal and operational reasons, she agreed not to enter the Manhattan penthouse, contact Altair directors, attend company events, or interfere with Grant's business activities until further notice. A second section asked her to acknowledge that her use of Altair travel services, corporate cards, apartment staff, and transportation had been discretionary benefits provided through Grant's employment and could be withdrawn at his direction. The final line required her electronic signature before the travel office would consider arranging a replacement flight. Nora read it once, then again more slowly. Grant had no legal power to remove her from a jointly occupied marital residence by sending a corporate form. The penthouse was part of their personal marriage, not an Altair office, and company administrators could suspend access to company accounts without deciding who had rights inside a home. But the document was not designed to settle those questions fairly. It was designed to create a record suggesting that Nora had left voluntarily, accepted Grant's version of their finances, and agreed to stay away during the days when he planned to present Camilla as Altair's future. Her phone rang before she finished the second page. "Sign it," Grant said. His voice was quieter now, separated from the dinner by a closed door. "Once you do, travel can book you somewhere comfortable. You canceled the existing ticket because you were coming back at the worst possible time. My mother was buried this morning, and I gave you space to grieve." Nora looked at the departure board while his sentence settled into its full ugliness. "This says I agree the apartment, cards, and travel were privileges you could revoke whenever you chose. They were. It also says I won't contact your board. There is no reason for you to contact them." "Then why include it?" Grant paused. "Because I know how you become when you feel cornered." She almost laughed, but grief had left no room for it. "You mean precise." "I mean vindictive." Behind him, a door opened, and Camilla's voice entered the call. "They're ready for the presentation." Grant answered her with a softness he had not used with Nora all day. Then he returned to the phone. "I'm trying to protect both of us. Sign the acknowledgement, stay in Savannah through the weekend, and let me manage the Meridian Atlas closing. After that, we can discuss a separation privately." "Has Altair disclosed the proposed change in leadership?" Nora asked. "Camilla's role is internal. You called her future president in front of executives. Stop pretending you understand transaction governance. And the additional equity you promised her?" The silence that followed was brief but unmistakable. Grant recovered quickly. "You saw a place card and invented a conspiracy. I saw a title you do not have unilateral authority to grant." His voice hardened. "You have no standing in Altair. You are my wife, not an officer, director, or shareholder. Do not confuse proximity with power." Nora lowered the phone and opened the PDF signature field. Her name was already typed beneath the line, waiting only for consent. She pressed decline and downloaded the unsigned document to the folder containing the canceled reservation, disabled travel profile, Grant's messages, and Camilla's photographs. Then she forwarded the acknowledgement to the number she had not yet called, adding one sentence. "Please verify my current authority, preserve every Altair transaction record already in our possession, and confirm whether final approval has been issued." A reply came less than a minute later from Daniel Mercer, General Counsel for Brooks Capital. "Authority confirmed. Final approval has not been issued. Do not sign anything." Grant believed he had forced Nora to choose between returning home and surrendering her rights. Instead, he had handed her the first written record showing exactly what he wanted her absence to conceal. By refusing to sign, Nora had not delayed Grant's plan. She had quietly moved it into the hands of someone required to preserve the truth. At 5:03 p.m., she left the airport seating area and stepped into an empty family restroom corridor where the noise of rolling luggage faded behind a concrete wall. Her black coat was still damp from the cemetery rain. The memorial program remained tucked inside her handbag, separate from the folder of screenshots and documents now stored on her phone. She called Daniel Mercer. He answered before the second ring. "I have the acknowledgement," he said. "Are you safe?" "I'm at the Savannah airport." Grant canceled the ticket, disabled the Altair travel profile, and sent a form conditioning replacement travel on my agreement to stay away from the apartment and his company. "Did you sign anything?" "No." "Good." Daniel's voice remained calm, not reassuring for comfort's sake, but precise enough to give the next minute structure. He explained that Altair could withdraw access to its own travel account and corporate card. It could not use that administrative control to determine Nora's rights in a marital residence, secure a waiver of unrelated claims, or manufacture consent by withholding transportation. Those questions belonged to personal counsel and proper legal process, not an executive assistant sending a PDF on company letterhead. "I don't want him warned yet," Nora said. "I want the records preserved before anyone edits the story." Daniel outlined the steps already available through Brooks Capital's existing governance procedures. His office would preserve every Altair document received during due diligence, including the term sheet, disclosure schedule, leadership materials, and correspondence already in the transaction file. The investment team would make no new approval and release no funds while he verified whether Altair had disclosed the leadership change Grant was presenting as settled. He would also confirm Nora's current authority through the trust records and the Brooks Capital operating documents. Do not contact Altair directly, Nora said. Not yet. Understood. This remains an internal verification unless the record requires escalation. And do not cancel the transaction because of what he did to me. Daniel was silent for a moment. You're separating the marriage from the investment. I'm separating grief from judgment. She leaned against the cool wall and closed her eyes. If Altair's disclosures are accurate, it should be reviewed on the merits. If they are not, I need to know before Grant realizes anyone checked. Daniel agreed. He asked whether she wanted Brooks Capital's travel office to arrange transportation. Nora looked through the glass doors toward the rain-dark runway. Using that office would not be a favor or a hidden rescue. It was an ordinary administrative service available to those conducting family office business. Still, she did not want to leave Savannah before collecting what Grant had tried to erase. Book the next reasonable commercial flight tomorrow morning, she said. No private aircraft. No special arrival. Send the itinerary only to me. At the Manhattan penthouse, Grant was still presenting Altair's expansion plan over Nora's dining table. Camilla stood beside the screen beneath the place card naming her future president, while executives listened to projections built around the expected Meridian Atlas investment. Grant told them the closing was procedural now, and that family office representatives had already accepted the leadership transition. No one in the room knew that final approval had never been issued. Nora remained in Savannah that night, reviewing the acknowledgement line by line while Daniel's office matched it against the existing transaction file. At 6:11, he called again. The trustee certification is current, he said. Your authority became active upon Dr. Brooks's death, exactly as the prior designation required. The investment remains unapproved, and Altair has not disclosed any final appointment of Camilla Price or any completed equity grant. Nora opened Grant's message telling her not to come home and read it once more. He believed he had removed her from the only rooms where decisions mattered. In reality, the first document, Daniel verified, placed the unfinished transaction inside a governance structure that could not proceed without her authority. The first consequence of Nora's refusal appeared before Grant finished dessert. Meridian Atlas froze the closing calendar and instructed Altair to stop describing the investment as approved. At 7:26 that evening, Nora sat alone in a small Savannah hotel room with her black coat draped over the back of a chair and her mother's memorial program resting beside the lamp. The rain had softened against the window. On the desk, her phone displayed the written cancellation record from the airline, Grant's messages, the unsigned acknowledgement, and Daniel Mercer's confirmation that no investment approval had been issued. She did not call Grant. She did not post a correction. She ordered soup she barely touched and waited while Brooks Capital followed the review process already required for a transaction of that size. In Manhattan, Camilla was midway through a presentation on Altair's expansion strategy when Grant's chief of staff received the notice. The message did not accuse anyone of fraud or mention Nora's marriage. It stated that Meridian Atlas's proposed $1.1 billion investment remained subject to final governance approval, that the closing schedule was temporarily paused pending verification of management and conflict disclosures, and that Altair was not authorized to present the transaction as completed. Grant read the email twice at the head of Nora's dining table. Around him, Altair executives stopped eating. The slide behind Camilla still showed projected acquisition dates, regional expansion, and her new title beneath the words post-closing leadership. This is administrative, Grant said. A routine pause. One executive asked whether Meridian Atlas had been informed of the planned leadership change. They know the broad structure, he replied. Camilla looked at him. You said they approved my role. They approved the strategy. That is not the same thing. Grant lowered his voice. Do not undermine me in front of the room. He turned back to the others and announced that the dinner would continue, but the confidence that had filled the penthouse earlier no longer held. The closing portal no longer allowed Altair to upload a final funding date. The calendar invitation for the signing gala remained active, but its status changed from confirmed to pending governance review. Camilla tried to access the shared leadership package through the transaction workspace. Her permissions had been limited to view only, while Brooks Capital verified the disclosures already submitted. She looked toward Grant again, this time without the polished smile from her photographs. Who triggered this? Counsel, he said. Someone on their side is being cautious. Because of Nora? Nora has nothing to do with Meridian Atlas. The certainty in his answer was so complete that Camilla accepted it for another minute. Grant still believed Nora's only leverage came from the role of grieving wife, and he had already removed her from the apartment, the travel account, and the company dinner. In Savannah, Nora received the same neutral status notice through Brooks Capital's secure system. She read it, closed the screen, and asked Daniel only one question. Has anyone at Altair attempted to change the leadership disclosures since the review began? His answer arrived with a reference to materials already inside the due diligence file. A draft board package had been uploaded 3 days earlier by Grant's office. Nora opened the existing file. The first pages proposed naming Camilla Price president of Altair immediately after closing. The next section recommended granting her an additional 7% performance equity tied to expansion targets funded by Meridian Atlas Capital. A communications page described Nora as Grant's estranged spouse with no operational involvement and suggested delaying any public separation announcement until after the investment closed. There was no approved board resolution, no completed equity grant, no final consent from Meridian Atlas. Yet Grant had already placed Camilla at Nora's table beneath a title built on those assumptions. Nora kept reading. The package also proposed presenting Grant and Camilla together at the signing gala as the leadership partnership responsible for Altair's future, while Nora remained in Georgia and out of sight. Canceling her flight had not been an impulsive act of cruelty. It had been part of the presentation. Grant had not merely wanted the penthouse for dinner. He had needed his wife physically absent while he reassigned her place in their marriage, rewrote her connection to his company, and promised another woman authority financed by money he did not yet control. Years before Grant learned to call Altair his creation, Nora had stood beside him in a freezing hangar at 2 a.m, holding together the first contract that could have destroyed him. The memory returned in the Savannah hotel room as she read the draft board package describing her as an estranged spouse with no operational involvement. 14 years earlier, Grant's company had been little more than a booking platform, 3 leased offices, and a promise to connect wealthy clients with charter operators faster than anyone else. Nora had believed in him before the projections looked credible. One winter night at Teterboro, an aircraft scheduled to carry a pharmaceutical executive team to Boston was grounded by a maintenance discrepancy less than 90 minutes before departure. The operator blamed Altair's scheduling software. The clients threatened to terminate the account. Grant paced between the hangar doors with his phone pressed to his ear, repeating that the failure was not his fault. Nora stood at a folding table beneath white industrial lights, reading the maintenance notice, crew duty limits, and alternate aircraft availability. Stop arguing about blame, she told him. Find out what can still move. He stared at her. You don't understand charter liability. Then explain why your system assigned an aircraft without confirming the maintenance release. The question silenced him. Nora called the operator's dispatch desk, located another aircraft positioned in Westchester, rebuilt the ground transportation plan, and helped Grant communicate the delay without promising what the company could not deliver. She stayed until the replacement flight departed at 3:18 a.m. The client kept the account. 2 weeks later, Grant told investors Altair had survived its first operational crisis because he had designed a culture that never accepts failure. Nora heard the line from the back of the room and said nothing. She had not wanted credit. She had wanted the company to live. 3 years later, when Altair needed to prove its platform could support a larger charter network, Nora spent 6 weekends at their dining table reviewing service failures and customer complaints. Yellow notes covered the wall above Grant's laptop. Delayed confirmations, duplicate manifests, weak vendor escalation, no single point of responsibility. Nora reorganized the process into stages, forcing the company to separate booking speed from operational verification. Grant used the structure in the strategy presentation that helped Altair secure its next major partnership. That night, in their Manhattan kitchen, he poured champagne into 2 mismatched glasses and kissed her forehead. When this works, he said, everyone will know we built it together. Nora believed him because love made private promises feel stronger than public records. As Altair grew, She protected his confidence the way she had protected his contracts. When executives praised him for ideas she had shaped, she let the moment pass. When he described her work as helping with details, she told herself marriage was not a competition. Her silence began as generosity. Grant converted it into history. He started saying Nora had never understood the business, that her foundation position existed because she needed something respectable to occupy her time, that Altair succeeded because he carried every serious decision alone. The more often he repeated it, the less he seemed to remember the hangar, the yellow notes, or the nights she used her own logistics experience to keep his promises from collapsing. Nora closed the draft board package and opened an older file Daniel had preserved as part of the existing Altair transaction history. It contained the original Meridian Atlas term sheet Grant had signed 8 months earlier. Beneath the funding schedule and valuation language was his electronic acknowledgement that any material leadership change, conflict of interest, or proposed equity grant had to be disclosed before final approval. He had once promised Nora that everyone would know what they built together. Now his own signature promised something more useful, that he could not quietly build Altair's future with another woman using Meridian Atlas money while pretending Nora had never been part of either story. Nora's authority had never been hidden from Grant. It had been written into documents he signed, mentioned in meetings he ignored, and dismissed as family paperwork that could never matter to him. 6 years earlier, she had sat across from her mother in a quiet conference room at Brooks Capital's Atlanta office, where the windows overlooked freight lines moving through the city like silver threads. Vivian Brooks placed 3 documents on the table: the Brooks Legacy Trust Certification, the operating agreement for Brooks Capital Holdings LLC, and the governance summary for Meridian Atlas Group. There was no ceremonial transfer, no sudden inheritance, no vault opening beneath the floor. The structure had existed for decades. The trust held 67% of the voting interest in Brooks Capital Holdings. Brooks Capital, in turn, controlled Meridian Atlas through its majority voting position and board appointment rights. Senior executives and the employee ownership pool held the remaining interests, ensuring that the company's growth did not belong to one family alone. Vivian had served as acting trustee while Nora was named successor trustee, authorized to assume control when Vivian died or became unable to serve. "This does not make the company your personal account," Vivian told her, tapping the trustee certification with one finger. "You will owe duties to the trust, the employees, and every decision tied to those voting rights." Nora signed the acknowledgement beneath her legal name, Eleanor Brooks Hale. She kept Hale in public life because she was still trying to build a marriage. She kept Brooks in the governance records because her mother had taught her that stewardship required continuity, not performance. Grant was informed that evening. Vivian invited them to dinner at her Savannah home and explained that Nora would eventually assume formal responsibility for the family office and its controlling interests. Grant listened while checking messages from Altair. "So she'll run the family foundation?" he asked. Vivian corrected him. "The foundation is separate. I am speaking about Brooks Capital and Meridian Atlas governance." Grant smiled as if the distinction were charming but unimportant. Of course, family oversight. He never asked what the companies owned, how the voting structure worked, or why Nora attended quarterly meetings in Atlanta. Because she did not arrive home announcing valuations, he decided the responsibility must be ceremonial. 3 years later, when Vivian's health declined, Nora began exercising delegated authority over major Meridian Atlas matters while Vivian remained trustee. Grant received calendar notices showing Nora in governance meetings and once signed a marital financial disclosure acknowledging that her trust-related interests were maintained separately from household accounts. He read the line naming Altair shares, real estate, and joint expenses. He skipped the pages describing beneficial interests and family office authority because he believed anything outside his own company could not affect his future. 8 months before the funeral, that belief followed him into the Meridian Atlas investment process. Altair signed a term sheet for a proposed $1.1 billion strategic investment. The document made clear that no money would move until due diligence was complete, final approval was granted, and Altair certified that all material leadership changes, conflicts, and equity commitments had been disclosed. Grant signed electronically. Camilla received the disclosure schedule. Both focused on the valuation, funding timetable, and post-closing expansion. Neither asked who controlled Brooks Capital's voting rights. In the Savannah hotel room, Nora reviewed the same documents Daniel Mercer had preserved. The trustee certification now identified her as sole acting trustee following Vivian's death. The operating agreement confirmed her managerial authority within Brooks Capital. The governance summary showed that the trust's 67% voting position controlled the approvals Meridian Atlas required for a transaction of this size. Nora could not take the company's money for personal revenge, and she could not erase Altair because Grant had betrayed her. But she was obligated to stop a closing if the investment record was materially false. Daniel highlighted the disclosures Altair had submitted. They contained no final appointment of Camilla, no proposed 7% equity grant, and no conflict disclosure concerning Grant's relationship with her. Yet the draft board package, the penthouse presentation, and Grant's own statements treated all three as settled. The condition was not secret. Grant had activated it himself by signing a term sheet that required full disclosure, then building his future around facts he chose not to disclose. Grant and Camilla were not merely planning to replace Nora at his side. They intended to use Meridian Atlas money to redesign Altair's ownership, leadership, and public identity before anyone with real authority could stop them. By Wednesday morning, Nora was back in Manhattan, seated inside a quiet conference room at Brooks Capital while rain streaked the windows above Midtown. She had arrived on an ordinary commercial flight arranged through the family office's travel desk, carrying the same black coat, the memorial program from her mother's funeral, and the folder of records Grant had created by trying to keep her away. Daniel Mercer sat across from her with the Altair due diligence file open between them. No one had announced her return. Grant believed she was still in Savannah, borrowing hotel money and waiting for him to decide when she could come home. The draft board package showed a plan larger than the place card on Nora's dining table. Immediately after the proposed $1.1 billion closing, Grant intended to nominate Camilla as president, award her an additional 7% performance equity, and consolidate daily operational authority beneath the two of them. The equity had not been approved, but the presentation treated it as inevitable. A voting analysis assumed Grant could preserve control through his 46% stake, Camilla's existing 3%, her proposed grant, and the support of directors who expected Meridian Atlas Capital to raise Altair's valuation. He cannot grant voting power that has not been authorized, Nora said. No, Daniel replied. But he expects the closing to make the board unwilling to challenge him. The communications section was more calculated. Altair would announce a new leadership partnership between Grant and Camilla at the signing gala, then describe Nora as an estranged spouse with no operational role. Her absence from the event was listed as evidence that the separation had been settled privately. The canceled flight, disabled profile, and residence acknowledgement now formed a sequence Nora could see with painful clarity. Grant had not simply wanted privacy for an affair. He wanted photographs of Camilla beside him when Meridian Atlas appeared to validate Altair's future. He wanted Nora off the guest list, out of the penthouse, and unable to contradict the story until after the investment funded his promises. Camilla understood enough to know the transaction was not yet closed. Her comments inside the draft presentation asked when the new equity would vest and whether the president title could be announced before the board formally voted. Grant had responded in the margin. Public momentum will make approval procedural. That sentence revealed the strategy. They planned to create the appearance of finality, then force directors, investors, and Meridian Atlas to choose between accepting the new structure or damaging a highly publicized transaction. What neither understood was that Nora was not an outsider trying to influence Meridian Atlas. As sole acting trustee, she controlled the voting interest that determined whether Brooks Capital could approve the investment at all. She could not appoint Camilla at Altair or remove Grant from his own company. She could insist that the investment record be truthful before the trust's capital moved. Grant called while Nora was still reading. She let it ring once before answering. "Where are you?" he asked. "Why?" "The signing gala is tomorrow. I heard you left Savannah. You told me not to attend. I'm reminding you. This is not a family event, and I will not have you creating a scene because you saw a photograph." Camilla spoke faintly beside him. "Tell her security has the list." Grant continued. "Your name has been removed." Meridian Atlas representatives will be there, and I need them focused on confidence, not domestic instability. Nora looked at the gala schedule already inside the transaction file. Her name did not appear as a spouse or guest. It appeared only in restricted governance materials Grant had never opened. Has your leadership package been fully disclosed? She asked. Everything important has been handled. And Camilla's equity? None of that concerns you. Nora closed the file. Then I won't interfere with your presentation. Grant mistook the answer for surrender. After the call ended, Daniel asked whether she wanted the gala postponed. Nora looked at Grant's signed term sheet, Camilla's proposed title, and the certification scheduled for the closing program. No, she said. Let them present exactly what they believe has already been approved. She would not warn them again. She would let Grant announce the future he had promised, let Camilla accept a role she did not yet possess, and let the people with actual authority verify the truth in the same room. Grant signed the certification beneath Meridian Atlas's name while Nora sat 20 feet away, dressed in black and holding the memorial program from the funeral he had tried to strand her at. The signing gala occupied the top floor of a Manhattan hotel, where glass walls framed the city in gold and navy light. Investors, Altair executives, and invited industry guests stood beneath suspended brass fixtures while a screen displayed the proposed $1.1 billion strategic investment as though the money had already crossed the wire. Nora remained at a table near the rear, her black coat folded over the chair beside her. Grant had removed her from the guest list, but Daniel Mercer had entered her through the governance credentials attached to Brooks Capital's transaction team. Grant did not notice her when he stepped onto the stage. Camilla stood beside him in a silver evening gown, one hand resting lightly against the podium as photographers captured the partnership they intended to make permanent through repetition. Tonight marks the beginning of Altair's next era, Grant said. Meridian Atlas has endorsed our expansion strategy, our leadership vision, and the team that will deliver it. The statement exceeded every approval actually granted. Nora did not move. On the screen behind him appeared the post-closing leadership chart already preserved in the due diligence file. Grant remained chief executive. Camilla Price appeared directly beneath him as president, with authority over strategy, operations, and integration. Camilla has been essential to this transaction, he continued. Following closing, she will lead the company's next phase and hold a meaningful equity position aligned with our future growth. Applause moved across the room. Camilla accepted the microphone. Meridian Atlas recognized that Altair needed decisive leadership, she said. Grant and I have built a structure capable of moving immediately once funding is released. Nora watched Daniel mark the time beside each statement. Neither Grant nor Camilla claimed ignorance now. They were publicly presenting a proposed appointment, an unapproved equity grant, and an investor endorsement as completed facts. When the remarks ended, an Altair attorney brought the scheduled management certification to the podium. The document required Grant to confirm that all material leadership changes, conflicts of interest, and equity commitments had been fully disclosed before final approval. He glanced at the signature page instead of rereading the terms. Camilla leaned close enough for Nora to see her whisper something. Grant answered with a confident nod and signed. The attorney turned the second acknowledgement toward Camilla. It stated that her proposed position and performance equity remained subject to board authorization and investment closing, and required her to disclose any personal conflict that could affect the transaction. She read the first paragraph, then looked at Grant. "This is standard?" she asked softly. "Completely," he said. "The approvals are already aligned." Camilla signed beneath his assurance. Only then did Nora allow herself to look directly toward the stage. Grant saw her. His hand stopped over the folder. Surprise gave way to anger so quickly that several people nearby followed his stare. "What is she doing here?" he asked, no longer speaking into the microphone. Camilla turned and gripped the edge of the podium. Security removed her name. Grant stepped away from the signing table and motioned toward an event coordinator. "She is not part of this transaction." Daniel rose before anyone approached Nora. He carried the trustee certification, the Brooks Capital Operating Agreement summary, the unsigned final approval page, and the disclosure schedule already central to the review. "Mr. Hale," he said, taking the microphone, "Meridian Atlas has not granted final approval, and the certifications signed tonight require immediate verification." Grant reached for the folder. Daniel kept it in view of the room. The proposed leadership change, equity commitment, and personal conflict were not disclosed in the materials submitted for approval. Camilla looked at Grant. You said they knew. He ignored her and faced Daniel. Who authorized you to interrupt this event? Daniel opened the trustee certification beneath the document camera. Nora's legal name appeared on the screen. Eleanor Brooks Hale, sole acting trustee. A second page identified the voting interest controlled through Brooks Capital Holdings. The room had not yet absorbed what the documents meant when Daniel turned toward the woman Grant had tried to exclude. Mrs. Hale, he said, as the person holding final governance authority for this investment, would you please join us and formally address the record? Nora did not walk toward the stage as Grant's grieving wife. She walked there as the trustee whose approval controlled whether a $50 billion enterprise would place a single dollar into his company. Daniel Mercer remained beside the document camera while she crossed the ballroom, the folded memorial program still in her hand. On the screen behind him, the trustee certification identified Eleanor Brooks Hale as sole acting trustee of the Brooks Legacy Trust following Vivian Brooks's death. The next page showed the trust's 67% voting interest in Brooks Capital Holdings LLC. Daniel then displayed the operating agreement summary confirming that Brooks Capital controlled Meridian Atlas Group through its majority voting position and board appointment rights, and that Nora held the managerial authority required to direct those interests. Meridian Atlas Group has an estimated enterprise value of approximately $50 billion, he said. Mrs. Hale does not treat that value as personal cash, nor may she use trust assets for private retaliation. She does, however, control the governance process that determines whether Brooks Capital approves this proposed investment. Grant moved quickly toward the signing table and pulled the unsigned final approval page from the folder. This was already negotiated, he said. The investment committee approved the terms. Daniel placed the term sheet beside the certification. The committee approved continued due diligence. Final authorization was expressly reserved. Grant flipped through the pages, searching for a signature he had assumed existed. Camilla reached for the leadership chart and turned it face down, but the audiovisual screen still displayed her proposed title and equity allocation. You knew about this? She asked Nora. Nora looked at the management certification Camilla had signed minutes earlier. I knew what Altair disclosed. I did not know what Grant promised you privately until the draft board package entered the transaction file. Camilla turned on him. You said my appointment had investor approval. It would have, Grant replied. This is personal. She is using the trust to punish me. Nora placed the memorial program beside the unsigned approval page. Her mother's photograph faced upward between the corporate documents. You canceled my flight, disabled my access, and tried to condition my return on a waiver, she said. None of that gives me permission to misuse Meridian Atlas. Your undisclosed leadership change, equity promise, and conflict are what require action. She did not mention the affair for the room's benefit. The signed certifications already carried more weight than humiliation. Daniel read the formal notice prepared under the existing transaction process. Final approval was suspended pending independent verification of Altair's management disclosures, conflict statements, and proposed equity commitments. No funds would be released. Altair was prohibited from describing Meridian Atlas as an approved investor or using its name in fundraising, recruiting, or public statements during the review. The gala announcement would be corrected before guests left. Grant reached for his phone and opened the transaction portal. His executive credentials still allowed him to view Altair's submissions, but the approval dashboard had changed. Final authorization, withheld. External representation rights, suspended. He attempted to upload a revised disclosure. The system rejected it and directed all further submissions to the independent review channel. You cannot lock me out of my own transaction, he said. Altair remains your company, Nora answered. Meridian Atlas remains ours to govern. Camilla removed the place card bearing the title president and folded it into her clutch. Then she tried to leave the stage, but Daniel asked her to remain available because her signed acknowledgement formed part of the review record. Grant called for the event coordinator to end the presentation. The coordinator looked to Daniel, then to Nora. She gave a small nod. The screen changed from the celebratory closing graphic to a neutral notice stating that the proposed investment remained under review and had not been approved. No one applauded. Nora stepped away from the microphone before the silence could become spectacle. The first consequence was immediate and procedural. Grant still held his Altair shares and his CEO title, but from that moment forward, he no longer had authority to represent that Meridian Atlas backed his leadership plan, his promised equity grant, or the future he had tried to announce as already his. By 9 the next morning, Grant was no longer selling Altair's future. He was answering to the board for promising away authority, equity, and investor approval he had never secured. The emergency meeting began in Altair's Manhattan conference room, with the gala recording paused on the screen behind him. Grant sat at the head of the table because he still owned 46% of the voting stock and remained chief executive. Nora did not attend as his wife. She joined by secure video from Brooks Capital with Daniel Mercer beside her, the trustee certification and transaction file already entered into the record. The Altair directors reviewed only what had existed before the reveal: the signed term sheet, the disclosure schedule, the draft board package, Grant's management certification, Camilla's acknowledgement, and the public statements captured at the gala. No one needed a new secret. The documents were enough. The board's independent directors suspended the signing process, removed Grant's authority to speak for the company regarding the Meridian Atlas transaction, and transferred all further negotiations to a special committee. He kept his CEO title while the review continued, but he could no longer revise disclosures, promise leadership appointments, or present the investment as approved. The transaction portal reflected the change within minutes. Grant's credentials were reduced to read-only access. Every proposed amendment had to move through the committee and Altair's counsel before Brooks Capital would receive it. "You are letting my marital dispute dictate corporate governance," he said. Nora's image remained still on the screen. "Your marriage did not create the unsigned approval page." Daniel directed the room back to the conflict section Grant had certified as complete. The board asked whether his relationship with Camilla had begun before he proposed making her president and granting her 7% performance equity. Grant refused to answer directly. Camilla, seated near the far wall, stopped watching him and began reading her own signed acknowledgement again. Her promised future was reduced line by line. The president title required board approval. The additional equity required a valid grant and a completed closing. The expansion plan, dependent on capital Meridian Atlas, had not released. Even the public introduction at the gala had been built on an investor endorsement that did not exist. "You told me the vote was already aligned," she said. Grant lowered his voice. It would have been if Nora had stayed out of it. Camilla looked toward the screen. She was never outside of it. That was the moment the promise finally broke for her. Grant had spoken as though he owned the board, the funding, and the authority to install her beside him. In reality, he controlled only part of Altair and had gambled the rest on the belief that Nora's silence meant irrelevance. The board suspended Camilla from all strategic transaction work pending the conflict review. Her existing 3% common equity remained hers, but the proposed 7% grant was withdrawn from the board package because it had never been approved. She was instructed to preserve communications and return all transaction materials to counsel. Grant tried to object, but the committee chair cut him off. "You signed a certification. We are reviewing your representations, not your confidence." By afternoon, 2 vendors called Altair asking whether the Meridian Atlas investment had collapsed. One regional operator delayed expansion planning. Finance warned that if rumors spread, employees might fear missed payroll or layoffs, even though the company still had operating revenue. Daniel asked Nora whether Brooks Capital should terminate the investment immediately. She looked through the conference room glass at analysts and operations staff moving between desks, none of them responsible for Grant's betrayal. "No," she said. "Keep the suspension in place. Fund nothing until the record is corrected, but do not use uncertainty to punish pilots, dispatchers, engineers, vendors, or customers." She authorized the review team to consider a protected transition plan if Altair could demonstrate truthful governance. Grant had tried to strand her because he thought control meant deciding who was allowed to move. Nora's first use of real authority was to make sure everyone beneath his mistakes still could. Over the next 45 days, Nora used the authority Grant had underestimated to keep Altair alive without allowing him to control the process that would decide its future. Meridian Atlas did not release the proposed $1.1 billion investment, and Brooks Capital did not pretend the transaction could continue as originally presented. Instead, Nora directed the trust's voting interests through the existing governance structure and required Altair to complete the independent review before any closing discussion resumed. The special committee examined the same materials already in the record: Grant's signed certification, Camilla's acknowledgement, the undisclosed leadership plan, the proposed equity grant, and the gala statements. No one was punished for gossip or private betrayal. The consequences followed the representations they had chosen to make. Grant remained Altair's largest individual voting shareholder and continued as chief executive during the transition, but the board extended the limits placed on him after the emergency meeting. He could not negotiate with Meridian Atlas, approve external claims about the investment, alter the leadership package, or promise equity without committee review. His company email still worked. His office remained his. What changed was the assumption that his signature alone could turn intention into authority. Camilla's suspension from strategic transaction work became a formal reassignment to her prior responsibilities while the board completed its conflict review. Her existing 3% equity remained untouched. The additional 7% disappeared from the proposed package because no valid grant had ever been approved. She was not escorted from the building or publicly humiliated. She simply returned to work without the title Grant had displayed on a place card in Nora's home. The future he had offered her had depended on money he did not control and a board he could not command by confidence alone. Meridian Atlas then presented Altair with a structured 45-day path forward. The company had to correct its disclosures, separate Grant from the investment negotiations, submit a revised governance plan, and demonstrate that payroll, vendor payments, flight operations, and customer obligations would remain protected during the review. The special committee approved the process. Brooks Capital agreed to continue due diligence, but released no funds and made no promise of final approval. Nora insisted that the review team distinguish between the executives who had created the problem and the employees who kept aircraft moving safely every day. Dispatchers still needed systems that worked at midnight. Engineers still needed approved maintenance budgets. Pilots and customers could not become leverage in a marital war they had never entered. Altair's finance team prepared a continuity plan using its existing operating revenue. Vendors received clear payment schedules. Employees were told the investment was under review, not that the company was collapsing. Nora refused to let Meridian Atlas use uncertainty to force concessions that had nothing to do with truthful governance. At the same time, she retained personal counsel in New York and began the formal separation process. She did not demand control of Altair or claim its shares as punishment. The attorneys identified marital property through the ordinary process, while the Brooks Legacy Trust and Brooks Capital interests remained separately administered under the structure Grant had acknowledged years earlier. Access to the penthouse was handled through counsel rather than text messages, and Nora retrieved her belongings without returning to the rooms where Camilla's place card had stood. Using Meridian Atlas's existing training budget, she also approved development of the Vivian Brooks Aviation and Logistics Fellowship, a paid program for students who could not afford unpaid entry into the industry. 9 months later, the first cohort would begin in Atlanta. By the end of the transition period, Nora had a new apartment, a quieter calendar, and no need to ask Grant for permission to travel anywhere. Yet one question remained beyond the reach of trust certifications, board procedures, and settlement drafts. When she finally stood in the program bearing her mother's name, would she still need Grant to understand what he had tried to take from her, or had freedom already begun the moment she stopped explaining? 9 months after Grant canceled her flight home from her mother's funeral, Nora stood beneath the morning light of an Atlanta training hangar and watched 20 young people receive the kind of beginning no one could revoke with a password. The first class of the Vivian Brooks Aviation and Logistics Fellowship gathered beside a white Meridian Atlas shuttle, each student wearing a Navy badge and carrying a folder marked with the program's name. Behind them, instructors moved between dispatch screens, maintenance diagrams, cargo routing models, and flight operations stations prepared through the company's existing training budget. Nora wore a cream suit, and her mother's memorial program rested inside a glass case near the entrance, beside a small plaque describing Vivian's belief that infrastructure mattered most when it carried people farther than they thought they could go. The program was paid, structured, and practical. Students rotated through logistics planning, airport operations, aircraft scheduling, facilities management, and financial controls. Several came from families who could not have supported unpaid internships. One young woman had already accepted a permanent dispatch apprenticeship. Another had designed a cold chain routing proposal that Meridian Atlas planned to test at one of its distribution centers. Nora listened as they spoke to their families, their voices unsteady with pride, and felt grief move through her differently than it had at the Savannah airport. It no longer felt like a door closing. It felt like something her mother had left moving forward. Altair had survived the 45-day review. The company corrected its disclosures, separated Grant from the Meridian Atlas negotiations, and operated under tighter board oversight. The strategic investment was restructured and remained subject to performance and governance requirements. But payroll continued, vendors were paid, and flight operations never stopped. Grant still owned his shares, though he no longer spoke as if ownership made every decision his alone. The board kept an independent committee over major external transactions, and he was not restored as the sole voice of Altair's future. Camilla returned to her prior strategy role after the review and later left the company through an ordinary professional transition. Her existing equity remained hers. The 7% grant had promised never materialized because it had never been approved. There were no dramatic photographs of either of them falling. Nora had not needed one. After the fellowship ceremony, she stepped outside into bright Georgia heat and found Grant waiting near the curb. He looked older than he had at the gala, not defeated, but reduced to the size of a man without a room arranged to agree with him. "The program is good," he said. "Thank you." His eyes moved toward the shuttle where students were laughing as they boarded. "I thought canceling the flight would make you come back on my terms." Nora looked at him for a moment, then at the Black Brooks Capital credential clipped inside her bag. She no longer carried it like a hidden answer. It was simply one tool among many responsibilities. "You thought the ticket was my way home," she said. Grant lowered his gaze. He did not apologize in a way that could repair anything, and Nora did not offer forgiveness as an exit from consequence. Their separation had become formal. The penthouse had been handled through counsel, and her life had already moved beyond the rooms where he once measured her dependence. She walked back inside and opened the glass case near Vivian's photograph. The memorial program from the funeral remained folded along its original crease. Nora placed beside it the fellowship's first graduation card, linking the day she had lost her mother to the day other lives began moving forward in her name. Then she closed the case and joined the students as the shuttle doors opened. Grant had canceled his wife's flight home from her own mother's funeral, unaware she controlled a $50 billion empire, and by the time he finally understood, Nora had already built a way home that no one else could cancel.